Yes, that's the usual response. Fungi seem harmless enough. Many species know otherwise, because there are some fungi who seek not to kill, but to control. Let me ask you, where do we get LSD from?
Where do you get it from?
It comes from ergot, a fungus. Psilocybin, also a fungus. Viruses can make us ill, but fungi can alter our very minds. There's a fungus that infects insects, gets inside an ant, for example, travels through its circulatory system to the ant's brain, and then floods it with hallucinogens, thus bending the ant's mind to its will. The fungus starts to direct the ant's behavior, telling it where to go, what to do, like a puppeteer with a marionette. And it gets worse. The fungus needs food to live, so it begins to devour its host from within, replacing the ant's flesh with its own. But it doesn't let its victim die, no. It keeps its puppet alive by preventing decomposition. How? Where do we get penicillin from?
Fungus.
Oh. True, fungi cannot survive if its host's internal temperature is over 94 degrees. And currently there are no reasons for fungi to evolve to be able to withstand higher temperatures. But what if that were to change? What if, for instance, the world were to get slightly warmer? Well, now, there is reason to evolve. One gene mutates, and an Ascomycetia, Candida, ergot, Cordyceps, Aspergillus, any one of them could become capable of burrowing into our brains and taking control, not of millions of us, but billions of us. Billions of puppets with poisoned minds, permanently fixed on one unifying goal: to spread the infection to every last human alive by any means necessary. And there are no treatments for this, no preventatives, no cures. They don't exist. It's not even possible to make them.
Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. And welcome to that clip from the HBO series, The Last of Us. It perfectly encapsulates, from a cosmic and psycho-spiritual level, what the Archons are doing to humanity, and effectively well for the last 3 years. I've included the mind virus fungi motif before on Aeon Byte. From clips of the Gnostic show Legion to the ideas of many past guests like Adrian Smith, Paul Levy, John Lamb Lash, Sean Stone, and Jerry Marzinski. These entities are real as egregores or propaganda magic.
Escade says there are minor gods called Archons who can cross the threshold. Supposedly, when they enter our world, they must inhabit a human body, which is a vessel. They cannot live outside it.
If we don't address the mind parasites now, humanity is doomed to become even more of a zombie species. There's probably little hope for most meat sacks worldwide, many of whom listen to this podcast. As Groucho Marx said, "I'm not crazy about reality, but it's still the only place to get a decent meal." Now, inflation and broken supply chains make it too expensive to get a decent meal. The Archons got us over a barrel.
I will know every thought in your head in just a few moments. All your memories, your senses, your fear, your suffering, all mine.
Yet you of the broken places have stared into the abyss and found that rainbow bridge of Nietzsche. You eat nervous breakdowns for breakfast. You look at Jesus crucified or Odin hung on the tree and go, "Gee, first time here?" You've been to hell so many times that Satan gave you a parking spot.
You can't play God without being acquainted with the devil.
Or maybe it's like what Emile Cioran wrote. We all live on the bottom of a hell where each second is a miracle. Regardless, as Franz Kafka also wrote, beyond a certain point, there is no return. This point has to be reached.
Whoa.
So welcome to that point of no return and that miracle at the bottom of hell. you high priests and priestesses of Hermes, the god of thieves, and Sophia, the goddess of smugglers. Welcome to Aeon Byte, officially. I'm still just Miguel Connor, your pompous of Gnosis.
The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. A process that cannot be understood by stopping it. We must move with the flow of the process. We must join it. We must flow with it.
Our astral guest will include the mind parasites in our interview. That is Jasun Horsley, who will be discussing his latest work, the Kubrickon, the cult of Kubrick, attention capture, and the inception of AI. As with all his excellent books, this is a red pill suppository the world needs, a Wetiko dispeller of the highest quality. If you're into Stanley Kubrick in any way, well, consider this the black pill suppository you're long overdue to shove where the black hole don't shine.
I am in a world of shit.
But that's how the Plato's Cave story goes. The spirit of the trickster tells us shadows at every corner have hoodwinked us. The Gnostic ethos tells us to kill our heroes after eliminating Buddha on the Fury Road. And it was Harold Bloom who said that the central dictum of the Gnostics was and always will be, that which can be broken must be.
Whoa.
To remove the mind parasites from your psyche once and for all, something must die on the cross or the tree.
It's the wanting. Huh? The Buddhists will tell you, all life is pain. Pain comes from always wanting things. It's the wanting.
But please keep this in mind. Your suffering, your depression, your emotional pain, and your trauma, it's all real. It hurts, and I don't like seeing you this way. That said, these painful realities, in the end, are a form of communication. In other words, there's nothing wrong with you. You are of the broken places, but you are not broken. Don't you see? Your trauma, your depression, your mental anguish is trying to speak to you in the form of a rising shadow complex. It has a story that must be heard. The shadow punishes until you allow it to integrate into your destiny.
Love isn't gonna save us. It's what we have to save. Pain makes us strong enough to do it. All our scars, our anger, our despair, it's armor.
Our shadow constantly communicates with us because it wants a seat at the round table. You are the heroic king who isn't seeing all of his kingdom. One of Arthur's great mistakes was that he ignored Mordred, his bastard son. Sophia's second great mistake was not acknowledging her bastard son, Yaldabaoth, as soon as he was conceived. Mordred and Yaldabaoth became their shadows, spectral dragons guarding the treasure of self-actualization. Like a heroic King Arthur, you must dare the cave of the unconscious and encounter the fearsome dragon, who wants to chat like Smaug in The Hobbit more than anything.
The dragon is one's own binding of oneself to one's ego, and you're captured in your own dragon cage.
That's the whole idea of Jung's active imagination. You create a dialogue with your unconscious and, quote, write your own gospel and live your own myth. It's not easy, but it can be done. many medical experts have diagnosed me as a rapid cycler manic depressive. I shouldn't even be alive or outside an institution. But through the years, after so many meetings with dragons at the bottom of a hell, miracles happened. I listened to the many me's that, yes, simply wanted to tell their story. And some wanted to be held, kissed, and told it wasn't their fault as a child.
But what is grief? If not love, persevering.
There are no guarantees. The sword of Damocles hangs over my head. But right now, I can spread my noses and I can reach out to you and tell you that your mental illness can be used to your advantage. I'm here to tell you that ecstasy is within your grasp, as is experiencing the embrace of Sophia as she comes to retrieve her children. And perhaps that includes the deformed Yaldabaoth. Perhaps.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
For those of you finding life unbearable, don't go anywhere. The shadow often takes the form of a suicide ideation complex. But, again, this mini egregore just wants a seat at the round table. This shadow happens when the ego becomes so distressed that it wants to pull the plug on the whole operation. The ego feels trapped in a worldview it finds intolerable. In truth, though, we've outgrown our old worldview/paradigm. The suicide impulse happens when the ego struggles under the weight of a paradigm more powerful and energized than the ego's ability to respond rationally.
I'll just fucking kill myself. I've been so fucking depressed. Everything's black.
You have a tendency towards depression, yes. But listen to me, all right? Everything's gonna be all right. I'm here. I'm with you. The kids are safe in their beds. They love you.
Right.
Jungian Robert Johnson wrote that the impulse towards suicide has the seed of change connected to it. The seed of change is the recognition that something must die. And something does indeed need to die. But it's not your physical self. It's your worldview. And let's face it, your beliefs have been programmed into your mind. Naturally, our worldview is the last thing the ego wants to give up. The worldview is the ego's GPS, its organizing principle for life. Changing our mind is the hardest thing we ever do, akin to the ancient concept of the metanoia, which means a spiritual conversion or salvation. A new worldview is a psycho-spiritual conversion, the ultimate change. So don't go anywhere, but get on the cross or tree and change your worldview. Go to that Kafka point of no return. Trust me, your true self won't go anywhere, except up and out of the dragon's cave.
The world in which you seek to undo the mistakes that you make is different from the world where the mistakes were made.
You are now at the crossing.
And all these worlds, heretofore unknown to us, they must have always been there, must they not?
You have a fantastic mission and purpose. I swear on my soul that you do. You are crucial to Sophia's rescue operation. Jasun probably agrees, as he's written personally and honestly about his own struggles. But all together, we can eradicate the archonic fungi. Let us get closer with our interview with Jasun.
I always let her go.
And that is your truth, Connor O'Malley.
I don't want it to be there. Now it's for real. Now she's gonna die and it's my fault.
And that is not the truth at all. You were merely wishing for an end of pain, your own pain. It is the most human wish there is.
I didn't mean it, though.
You did, but you also did not.
How can both be true?
How can a prince be a murderer and be loved by his people? How can an apothecary be evil-tempered but right-thinking? How can invisible men make themselves more lonely by being seen?
I don't know. Your story has never made any sense to me.
Because humans are complicated beasts. You believe comforting lies while knowing full well the painful truth that make those lies necessary. In the end, Connor, it is not important what you think. It is only important what you do.
So what do I do?
What you did just now. You speak the truth.
That's all.
You think it's easy? You were willing to die rather than speak it.
So tired. So tired of all this.
And sleep.
This is the A.M. Bide interview. And with us, we have the pleasure, as always, to have Jasun Horsley, this time to discuss his latest book, The Kubrickon, The Technology of Evil. Jasun, how are you? And thank you very much for coming on.
Hi, Miguel. Just to point out that the subtitle, you got the wrong subtitle because that was a very early thing, and they got subtitle confused with my upcoming book, Big Mother. So the correct subtitle is The Cult of Kubrick, Attention Capture, and the Inception of AI.
Oh, okay. I like the former one, but yeah, I think for marketing purposes, keyword purposes, the second one's much better.
Well, as I say, the technology of evil is the subtitle of the next book, of the follow-up.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
I haven't got to the evil yet. It takes me a while to work myself up to it.
To get yourself down into Hades, like a mystery religion, huh? Well, awesome. Yeah, I enjoyed the Kubrickon, so I think we should definitely cross it because the die has been cast. As you say, this is the first book written about Stanley Kubrick by someone who doesn't like Stanley Kubrick. As you write in your book, Jasun, all your other works are of individuals who are at one time your gurus or spiritual inspirations. Carlos Castaneda, Philip K. Dick, Aleister Crowley. But this time you wrote a book about somebody that you didn't even like. Why did you do this?
Right. I got that question in the last interview. It's yeah, I guess I do put it front and center. Why did I do it? How was I unable to avoid it? Well, I mean, there's that saying that if you really dislike something, you form a bond with it anyway. Right? It's only if you're really neutral or indifferent to something that you don't create a bond or some sort of connection to it. So if you really love something, you create a bond, and if you really hate something, you create a kind of bond too. So I guess I'm inadvertently bonded with Kubrick through, because as you know, if your listeners don't, movies were kind of my religion in a way, because I grew up without a religion, atheist parents, and nature was a vacuum. Something had to fill that void of meaning, and for me it was movies. And so I loved movies, and I started reading criticism of movies and writing my own reviews and scripts and stuff at a young age in my adolescence. And one of the people I discovered was Pauline Kael. And Pauline Kael never liked Kubrick's films either. And so she was kind of an ally in that formative period in my resistance to or defiance of what later became the Kubrick cult, or what I later became aware of as the Kubrick cult. So I kind of, something about Kubrick was a threat to my emerging sensibility there, because I loved movies and I admired movie directors and I wanted to become one. But the dawn of movie directors, even back then in the early 80s, was pretty much Kubrick. There were a couple of others contenders, but Kubrick was certainly in the top three. And the fact that that fact alone was very disturbing to me because I just didn't like his movies. So I think even from a fairly young age, I was like, what's going on with Kubrick? Like, why is he so overrated? Was my viewpoint back then. And into my 30s, I just considered him the most overrated filmmaker of all time. And that was enough for me, enough of a reason for me to be curious about him and to write about him a little bit. I didn't write essays about him or his career or his films, but I did refer to him quite a bit in my early film books. And I did like his earlier movies up to Dr. Strangelove. And then in the 2010s, I'm not sure, around 2014, somewhere around that time, I ended up getting sucked into what became the Kubrickon, not just the book, but what the book's about. And that was a combination of factors, but I think the most important one to mention is what I refer to as the cult of Kubrick, which is an internet-based cult, as compared to the cult of Kubrick that was around even in the 80s, which was the intelligentsia and the film critics, not counting Pauline Kael, who basically adored Kubrick and thought he was the greatest thing since D.W. Griffith, I guess. But then later this internet-based cult emerged, which Room 237 explores, by Rodney Asher, that film documentary, which is all this endless, meticulous analysis of Kubrick and the deification of him in a different kind of context, as a sort of a living, visible human archon of the arts, an archon of the arts, might coin that phrase there. And I knew some of these people. You see, I wrote a piece for the Synchro Mystic book. And I knew various synchro mystics, and some of them anyway, they held Kubrick up as their lord and master. So I had a personal stake in it at that point. It wasn't just these faceless critics out there. It was actually people I knew. And I engaged in this struggle with them to try and show them that they had been hoodwinked, that they had been lured into a trap. And that's what I ended up exploring, researching, uncovering, that became the Kubrickon.
It's a great read, yeah, as you write in your book. This is the ego's dream made flesh, and it makes Kubrick a mythical figure of the satanic kind, a demiurge worship for all the wrong reasons. And as you write too, it's some critics even go as far as say, well, you just have to watch it twice to get Kubrick. It's like, what? You have to change your mind like Alex in A Clockwork Orange, force yourself to like him. And that's what really happened, is that I think for some reason I was thinking of the movie Mystery Men, where everybody's talking about the Sphinx and they're going, ooh, he's terribly mysterious. And you get this guru who's going to train superheroes, and the Ben Stiller character just realizes, wait a second, this guy is just, this is all empty shit. It's nothing. Is Kubrick kind of like that? He created the myth to hide whatever it was that we're going to talk about later?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point to begin at, because that would have been my view up until the period where I started the Kubrickon, almost 10 years ago. Was it basically this the void? The emperor has no clothes. But through looking more and more into that abyss, having it stare into me, I began to believe, at least, I began to see what I thought was evidence of an intentional void, that Kubrick wasn't simply, first of all, it's absolutely true that Kubrick did engineer his own legend. He was he went to concerted lengths, efforts. Like when you said that this is the first book written by somebody who didn't like Kubrick, it just occurred to me for the first time that if Kubrick was alive, I might not have been able to write this book.
You'd be in his crosshairs, yeah.
Well, I don't know actually. It may be vain of me to think he would have even noticed because it's such a small press and so on and so forth. But I think if he had heard about it, he might well have cared. Because he was very controlling about what was published about him, insofar as an artist can control his press. Obviously, he couldn't control every film critic and every reviewer, but in terms of the books that were published, he did stop at least one book being published because it was too impartial. Right? It wasn't just eulogistic of him. So Kubrick really did work very hard on cementing his legend as a great filmmaker, or the greatest filmmaker. And this is a part of my thesis. And as it pertains to this, The Emperor Has No Clothes idea, my thesis isn't that Kubrick was like there was nothing going on there. It's just that I'm arguing that he wasn't actually an artist in the way that he's been raised up and in the way that he wanted to be raised up, that he was working on something much more methodological, much more scientific, with a specific goal that was really independent of creating good movies. That the movies were means to another mysterious and hidden end. And the emptiness at the center of his movies wasn't simply, as I used to believe, due to an emptiness in Kubrick, but a deliberate, intentional emptiness, which has to do with a kind of, I'm not sure if the term would be mind control, but perception management, let's use that term, by which, as I said at the beginning, I think nature abhors a vacuum. Well, the human psyche abhors a vacuum too. So if we go to a movie, I'm sure there's a known phenomenon for this, but it's not coming to mind right now. If we go to a movie and it's missing certain elements, I'm thinking also on the internet, like with, like one of the reasons that smileys were invented is because because text is very cold, and therefore, we tend to project onto a line that we read in an email a certain human emotion that isn't necessarily there, because we can't know, based on the text, what the person meant, what they were actually feeling. And this is why the smileys became important, so you could stick a smiley or winking, whatever, to let the person know what the emotional tone of those lines is. Well, Kubrick, I believe, intentionally made cold movies, so knowing that human beings are emotional creatures and they need to have things imbued with emotion. And if there isn't human emotion or feeling there, they will imbue it with their own emotions. They will project onto this relatively blank screen. There's that famous thing as well about that. I think it's Eisenstein. There's a picture of a man's face, and it gets juxtaposed with different things. So first of all, the face is juxtaposed with a plate of food, then it's juxtaposed with a naked woman, and so on. And people who, according to what it's juxtaposed with, they see the face as hungry or lustful or afraid, right? And so in this analogy, the Kubrick movie is the face that's basically blank and expressionless, and the following image, whether it's the food or the naked woman, is the audience's own psyche. So when you juxtapose something that's kind of empty of human elements with a human being, that human being will then imbue the emptiness with their own consciousness. So that's very central to the Kubrickon thesis, and it's consistent with my initial, like for years and years, for decades even, my feeling of unease around Kubrick films, that they were somehow empty and that they were cold and that they were devoid of human feelings, which is what Pauline Kael wrote about them, among other things. It's just that I never suspected until much later that might not only be intentional, but intentional with a goal or a purpose that was really entirely independent of cinematic art and to do with some whole other agenda.
Yeah, we definitely want to talk about it, but it makes sense. I mean, in one section, Jason, you compare Hitchcock to Kubrick, and you write, Hitchcock catered to audiences, but Kubrick aimed to confound them. And you showed, how many movies Hitchcock made, a ton of movies, and there's a warmth, a sort of hermetic power to them, while Kubrick was, as you write, offered something more than mere entertainment. And somehow, as you write, he didn't have a hit after A Clockwork Orange, but he still had carte blanche to basically do any movie he wanted, regardless of how much money it lost. So something was at play there. But I guess we can dispense with the idea of, well, it's interesting because this egregore or this thing happened after he died. Maybe he engineered it or not, but the idea that Kubrick is like Trump, he's this insider that's part of the machine and he knows the machine, or Elon Musk, and he's come out and he's trying to tell us this is how we can bring down the machine or drain the swamp. And this sort of persona as a prophet that Kubrick has, we can pretty much dispense with that one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's good. That's fine with me.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a very powerful, and again, it happened after he died. That's the interesting part. So it's like wondering, was he planning to make himself that way, or again, did we fill in the blanks looking for a savior?
Well, I mean, something began after he died, I suppose, in terms of, as I said, the cult of Kubrick that really was generated via the internet. I mean, the internet was around when he died, and it was beginning when he in the 60s with DARPA, as I write about. So Kubrick, he was around long enough to see at least the beginnings of the success of his project, if I'm even at all right in my thesis, because I don't have any smoking gun, and I don't even really have very much hard evidence. I mean, there's some hard evidence in the book, I think, but not really specifically that he was planning to use the internet, or he was making movies that he foresaw would be somehow synthesized with the internet and the collective consciousness that informs the internet and that it hooks into the internet, as in humanity, so that both would be transformed, like his movies and his reputation and his all that would be transformed by the internet, but the internet would also be transformed via the influence of the films. Now, it's not obvious unless you look for Kubrick on the internet, but if you do, if you go on YouTube and look for Kubrick videos, you'll find a hell of a lot of Kubrick videos, and they're not just,
oh my god, yeah,
I mean, most of them aren't critical, as in, I mean they're not by film critics. They're this second class that I'm talking about, who are looking for clues to the nature of the universe in Kubrick's work. Now, that I would argue that he did foresee and anticipate and even calculate in advance. I really suspect that. I mean, I can't, as I say, I can't prove it, but it does seem as though it's consistent. There's a continuum really between this kind of fanatical basement dweller fascination with Kubrick of sifting through his work for clues to the riddle of the Sphinx, and the kind of obsessive attention that he was already generating from audiences, but mainly critics and other filmmakers pre the internet. And that, as I said earlier, there's no doubt that he, in my mind anyway, that he intended that, and that he performed various acts, or he made his movies in certain ways, and there's an awful lot of different clues and indications, which hopefully, I mean, as many as I could find are compiled in the Kubrickon, that Kubrick was intentionally creating a meta-narrative, not just through his movies, but around his movies and around him himself. For example, the moon landing. Like, the idea that Kubrick faked the moon landing, I think it's highly likely, more likely than that he actually did fake it, that meme was started by Kubrick, or at least that he was conscious that it was going to be created, that he was somehow complicit with that.
I think you make a good argument in the book for sure. And again, you and I have followed Philip K. Dick, so his idea of how technology and the human psyche can infect each other like a virus and create new things that aren't exactly positive. It would make sense that people in the 60s and 50s were like, well, we're going to farm this, we're going to herd, and we're going to breed this sort of interaction of the human mind and technology. So for your thesis, and again, let me read this from your book, and we can go from there. But you write, I propose that Kubrick's later films are cultural artifacts designed as scientific instruments to interact with human consciousness and cross-bond with it, create an obsession, as a means of gathering data from the species and importing it to a machine database. It's like like a Trojan horse. In other words, we're part of this experiment to make the machines more conscious and somehow make us less conscious. Is that it, Jason?
Yeah, that's it. And it is. I'm glad that you found that passage, because it'd be impossible for me to try and recreate it just through my thinking processes. Right. And it's very hard to just flatten it out like that. And
you're already working on your next book. I'm busy.
No, I mean, I'm done with it. I thought I'd retired from writing by the time I ended up getting the Kubrickon ready for publication. So it was like a haunting or something. But this, I mean, it is like my next book, hopefully my last nonfiction book, we'll see, is very much specifically about metaphysical entities and how they are feeding on our consciousness and using our psyches to inseminate themselves, to give birth to themselves and our bodies for that matter. So that's why I say it took, I had to work my way up to really going into the technology of evil. And it is extremely difficult to talk coherently about the subject of consciousness as a currency, as a, what's another word for that? It's more than just a medium, but something that can actually be harvested and siphoned off and then rechanneled. Like, because we don't really have a way to quantify consciousness, even though we're in it, we experience it, and nothing happens without it. But if we look at the internet, which we do every day, I mean, if we think about or observe how we interact with it, it's conscious interaction with consciousness. Like you and I, we're two consciousnesses that are interacting through the internet. Although the internet per se isn't conscious, everything, the internet is built out of consciousness, because every program that we use was built by conscious programmers. And then those programs and even the hardware that gets even more mysterious there is informed like accumulatively by that consciousness. So, I mean, Facebook is the easiest go-to, although I don't use Facebook. Maybe Twitter is pretty much the same. That you can see that that's a software, if you will, that has taken over the planet and that is constantly gathering more and more data. Like it's getting more and more imbued with human consciousness by the endless interaction. And by the same token, human beings are interacting more and more through Facebook or other social media, and thereby, while the media itself, the software, etc., is becoming, if not more conscious, at least more informed, more saturated with this data that comes out of consciousness, the human beings themselves are becoming potentially less and less conscious, because they're just clicking like, they're just they're being processed by algorithms. Their decisions are being determined by algorithms more and more. So that requires less and less consciousness. You don't have to think of anything to say. Well, it's like an email as well. You start to write, I don't use Gmail, but you start to write a sentence and the program will tell you how to finish it, right?
Yeah, these are the days. And obviously Kubrick was meant to do AI. Maybe that was the climax of his experiment. And I think that's what he was going for. Yeah, and here's another quote to keep it in perspective for the audience. You say your first thesis is somewhat fantastical, largely speculative, and possibly unprovable. And I'm saying, yes, you give a lot of data. You make a good argument. going back to quoting you, you say, it is bluntly put that Stanley Kubrick was involved in a secret project to create artificial intelligence via stimulating and harvesting of collective human attention, using a combination of his film opus and the internet to do so. The second hypothesis, or hyperthesis, is that Kubrick's career was shaped, directed, and enabled as part of an ongoing government, military, scientific, and intelligence program of social, cultural engineering, popularly known within the conspiratainment circle as a PSYOP, a psychological operation. So that's it right there, and I think you put a good arguments to it. I mean, Kubrick was connected to all these power players, right?
Well, yeah, and I do spend some time in the book listing the different correspondences. Now, I know that people who aren't conspiratorially minded, or I might prefer just to say they're not educated or informed about the nature of the world, I know there's a tendency for them to think, well, it's just joining the dots. I mean, you could list a whole bunch of other data and so on, but that's really missing the point. That, I mean, I think I do demonstrate reasonably persuasively that Kubrick's career was facilitated, that he had help from a very early stage in his career. And certainly it's clear that, as you mentioned, I mean, he had an inordinate amount of power and freedom within the film industry that was not based, like Steven Spielberg or George Lucas, it wasn't based on making money for the studios. No. It was based on his reputation. Now, you could argue, well, the studios do, obviously, the clout of having Kubrick on your payroll or making movies for your company, that's better than money. That's worth more than gold. And that's fair enough. That could be a sufficient explanation if it weren't for all these other things. And also if the world wasn't the way that some of us know that it is, and really all of us should know by 2023, that the world of mass media and entertainment is every bit as essential to the maintenance of hegemonic powers as the military. So people, they don't, it's not just some crapshoot, and it's certainly not some meritocracy, whereas if you're really good, you manage to get successful and you manage to become an instrument of global propaganda. Well, no, obviously it doesn't work that way. I mean, movies are the most powerful tools of propaganda of the 20th century, certainly. And well, it's a bit up for grabs in the 21st century because things are morphing so quickly. But yeah, so for Kubrick to have been so supported and so propagated himself, for him to develop the reputation he's developed, he was clearly perceived as of great interest, as an asset to the machinery of those different factions. So what I'm arguing, because I think there are cases perhaps where a filmmaker or another artist is mostly unwitting and mostly unconscious of their being useful. I'm thinking of Philip K. Dick, but Philip K. Dick wasn't really that successful while he was alive. But I think now that he's as big as he is after he's dead, some of us have to question, well, what was it about his work that was perceived as something not to be suppressed, but to be promoted and to be incorporated into the machinery of the superculture and the state controls and all the rest of it? There really was something about Dick's work that was deemed compatible with a transhumanist drive, unfortunately for Dick. But he's an example of somebody, I think, who was genuinely, sincerely working away in his own basement, so to speak. And he kind of tapped into the zeitgeist in such a way that, unfortunately, later his work was able to be co-opted. But with Kubrick, the evidence suggests that he was very much a conscious, witting player, and that he was deeply involved in trying to change the world, let's say. I mean, like he was very ambitious. Nobody would argue against that. But I'm arguing that he was far more ambitious than simply filmmaker who wants to make the greatest movies of all time, that he was working towards a different goal that, as you just read in that quote, was compatible with the larger goals of social engineering and with a scientific technocratic superstate. I mean, it's no secret that Kubrick was a technocrat, that he was in sympathy with the technocratic principles and values. He made no secret of that. And his only film that has any kind of optimism in it is 2001, which is considered generally to be his great work, and if not, one of the greatest movies of all time. And that the optimism of that is a scientific, technological, even specifically transhumanist kind of optimism.
Exactly. As you write, Jason, 2001 is a religious fantasy disguised as a scientific parable. So it was, and as you write too, it came at the time when LSD and the whole psychedelic movement was going. The movie is like, it's a perfect fit for sort of the psychedelic Terence McKenna religious experience. And it did its job, didn't it do it? It did. It worked perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you and I were not going to argue over this, and maybe it'll be frustrating for viewers because many of them, listeners, I mean, many of them probably will disagree and they'll want somebody to question this viewpoint. But certainly that 2001, even today, is held up as this epitome of artistic genius and visionary brilliance, not just by filmmakers and film critics and film lovers, but within, I'm not sure what we call it, but I don't know how to really categorize, but there's a lot of people out there who aren't mainstream. Maybe I should just say within the second matrix, people who are into conspiracy and into occultism and into self-expression and creativity, and believe that they really are at least aspiring to being on the cutting edge of the revolution of consciousness, or whatever kind of term. And certainly psychonauts, as you point out, people who have had their consciousness and their perceptions and their beliefs shaped by psychedelics. So it's not necessarily some of the best people, but certainly some of the people that you and I are going to have a lot of contact with and a lot in common with, and generally feel that they're simpaticos. I have found that it's very hard to find people who will question the brilliance of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It really is like a religious artifact to many of these people.
That's it. It's a metaphysics, but it does promote the ideas of transhumanism and AI and humans evolving away from the planet, all the stuff that is a big issue today. But we have to admit, it was facilitated by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, the little pedophile. I don't want to say the word because it's the internet, but we know how Arthur C. Clarke was. And as we talked in our last interview, I mean, this is not. You mentioned movies are the great tool of propaganda. There's the apocryphal story of Stalin saying, if give me Hollywood and communism will rule the world in 2 weeks. And we know that the military, the CIA is behind all these movies, whether it's the new Top Gun or anything. Or we talked in our last interview how The Exorcist was used to be able to measure people's heartbeat and trauma and all that. So this is happening, and it is happening. It's almost like, isn't it? It's almost like the evil villains would be stupid not to do it, right? I mean, it's like right in your lap.
Yeah. But on the other hand, by the same token, it's very hard not to get split down the middle by this, because we grew up on this propaganda, and there's a great Jacques Ellul comment in his book Propaganda that the power of propaganda is that it relieves the modern man's sense of loneliness, and that's like that's quite a surprising statement, because we think of propaganda in this very specific way, like it's Big Brother and it's basically berating us or bullying us or manipulating us into being subservient. But no, I mean, it's certainly in the West, the propaganda is far infinitely almost more subtle than that. And it's actually making me think of these demonic entities that I'm writing about now, that they have to ingratiate themselves to us. The propaganda has to appeal to us in this very deep way, and it has to meet a need that our parents and our society and our schools and all that are not meeting. And thereby insinuate itself into our consciousness. So we can, as I found out to my my chagrin, my regret, we can get as informed as we like about the reality of movies, etc., being part of this widespread perception management propaganda campaign, if you will, that's gone on for, well, decades, if not hundreds of years. But we don't necessarily stop watching the movies, and we can't necessarily get them out of us. Like I pretty much stopped watching movies, but if I still can't think of Jaws or Good, the Bad, and the Ugly without enormous affection. I just think they right. But I know that I can't. That's a double standard, right? I might be immune to Kubrick, but that doesn't mean that the other things that I like are any less pernicious. Right? It's just that I let them in. Right? I let them inform my sense of who I am. So I don't know what the cure is anyway, Miguel. Exactly. Well, maybe I do, but it's not in the Kubrickon. I didn't get
for next. Yeah, I'd say just knowledge is an important one, and I want to keep repeating this to the audience so they get it. But you're also right. It's engineering the technology that is engineering our consciousness to imitate them. It's a trap for our consciousness. It's sort of a breeding interaction, and I think you make a very good argument for this. And again, we can go Philip K. Dick, Marshall McLuhan, Heidegger. People were talking about this sort of interaction and how consciousness would shift and infect each other, and who would have control of it and all that. So, but just a quick question. You're talking about these mind creatures. I was thinking, have you gone like full circle with Carlos Castañeda and his predators and these mind parasites?
It depends what you mean by full circle. I mean, although I had to reject Carlos Castaneda as a false teacher, mostly because the guy went mad. So generally,
not a good ending.
Same way about Nietzsche, really. Like, you don't really necessarily want to handle the radioactive materials that destroyed somebody else's life.
Right.
That's obviously risky. But although I had to accept that I couldn't trust those books or the person who wrote them, I never really reneged on my felt sense that they were imbued with profound truths. I've never thought anything but that. I never changed my mind about that. It's just, is it safe to talk or write about them? Well, I mean, I did even explore this some 10 years ago. Like, how could we write about the flyer mind or the inorganic entities? Inorganic predators was the term I coined back then, without using their mind to do it. Like, they've given us the language, they're giving us, right? So, and
you're inviting them in every time you write about it or talk about it. They're coming.
Well, I'm not sure about that one, because they're already in anyway.
Yeah.
So it's more like just that actually writing and talking about these entities may well be playing into their hands, because I mean, if they're going to exercise their control, their sway over our consciousness whenever they can, and they're going to be particularly alert to doing so when we put our attention on them. Like, we're going to get rumbled now, we better move it, come on, bring the whole team in now and just scramble his brain completely, and we'll turn it into something salacious and exciting, or whatever they do, or fear mongering that generates fear. But yeah, to answer your question more directly, I guess I have come full circle in the sense that things that I feel now that I wrote and talked about prematurely in my 20s and 30s, I now feel in my 50s that not only am I ready to address them again or in a new way, but it's become imperative to do so. That it's
I agree with you. I'm all for these. I believe so. Whether it's Castaneda or Colin Wilson or others who have talked about these alien mind parasites, it's important we know about them. Personally, that's how I feel.
Yeah, but of course, the thing is, we do know about them from these other authors, right? So, and that hasn't worked so far. So, it's also important that we know that the stuff we don't know about them, including we don't quite know how to talk about them, much less get free of them. Right? That's the only objective is to get to rid our lives of these entities and not be controlled by them. So that's the real question: is how do you address if you're swimming and even drowning in a sea of entities? What do you do about it? How do you address that reality in a way that will lead you to solid dry land?
Yeah, that's a good question. Many options. I mean, we're being eaten by microbes and bacteria and many creatures inside of us. So each one of us is an entire world, and that includes the metaphysical world. So it's a jungle out there sometimes, I feel.
Well, that was Castaneda's view. I know that we live in a predatory universe.
Right. Yeah.
And so, that's one aspect of reality, but I don't think it's the whole thing. I think it's a question of, we're stuck in a particularly dark place right now, collectively as a species, and the only way to move out of it is to fully recognize it. And that's the bottom line seems to be just how much are we pretending isn't out there, like with I probably shouldn't mention this because I don't want to get you taken offline, but with the last couple of years with a certain so-called medical cure that was highly experimental at best, clearly we can see, well, some of us feel we can see that ignorance was not the right policy there. It didn't matter if you believed, how fervently you believed that it wasn't going to harm you, or that the government knew what it was doing, or that you can trust the medical establishment. Those beliefs were delusional. But there's clearly a lot of investment then in continuing to believe that. So as always, the challenge is to just be willing to see what's actually going on before you make any rash decisions.
Yeah, for sure. And for the audience, I was thinking, because many millennials and Gen Zs think that movies only started this century. So there might be, in a way, we've never watched Kubrick, who cares? But as you write, Kubrick, of course, had many disciples. I mean, a good master isn't just going to, just stop because he's going to make sure that the virus continues. So as people joke on the internet, when you watch a movie by Christopher Nolan, who's one of his disciples, it's like, it feels like you're being prodded. And I'm talking like, somebody stroking like watching a Hallmark movie where your heartstrings are. So you feel like you're being hit from all sides. Your heart rate goes up. You're being hit on all sides. But when you walk out, you have like a sense of emptiness. And comedians have joked about this. And I think that's what makes people can relate who are younger. Think of a Christopher Nolan movie. You walk out and almost feel like you've been, violated, and you feel kind of exhausted. And it's almost like somebody has taken part of your soul, right, Jason?
Well, it seems, again, part of what I was just referring to a moment ago is that we're not living in a time in which escapism is a good strategy, right? Like the world is, I would say, literally going to hell. Mm-hmm. And so life could hardly be more dramatic. It could hardly be more at stake. We're engaged, know it or not, in spiritual warfare now, and most people are not engaged They're just cannon fodder for these entities, but nonetheless, they're on the battlefield, and the bullets are, tearing through their flesh, almost literally, with this damn medical policies. But anyway, so yeah, I think that's an important part of the context, that if you're escaping from a terrifying reality that you're not willing to even admit is what it is, so you're not even aware of why you're doing it, and then you go to a movie to have your senses pummeled for 2 or 3 hours, the movies are getting longer, aren't they? Then of course you're going to feel drained and numb and empty afterwards, because essentially you've laid yourself open to just be absorbed by the very thing that's turning your life into hell. So I think I do wonder, like, how many, you're talking about younger people, do they even watch movies anymore? I think that they might, never mind Kubrick, I think they might just be thinking, well, movies, I don't even watch movies.
And they don't watch it in one sitting. They'll look at their phones. They'll do, they have not like we going, like you said, that shamanistic mystery religion of sitting in the dark and letting it just hit you. That's over. That's over.
I mean, certainly cinemas are pretty much over.
Right.
But even, the younger generations don't have the attention span, as you just pointed out, for a movie. Even on YouTube, probably mostly they don't watch something if it's over 10 minutes or something. And inseparable from this, which could bring us back to the Kubrickon, and this would seem like a good thing, but sadly it isn't. I think younger generations are much more into interactive media. They want to actually be creating it. They want to be participating in it. So if it's either social media or it's their own platforming, and et cetera, et cetera. And they might not. This might not seem relevant to them in terms of Kubrick unless they're into conspiratainment and whatnot. But I wouldn't want to have published a book about Kubrick if it was only about Kubrick and what he did 30, 20 years ago, rather as an example of one of the architects of the current artificial intelligence, algorithm informed psychic harvest machine called the internet, but it's more than just the internet. I mean, we're moving into the internet of bodies now, whereby the whole planet, the aim is to make the whole planet, including or especially human bodies, part of a semi-sentient kind of linkage, machine linkage network infrastructure. I don't even have the words for these things, unfortunately, because I try not to think about them too much, but everybody will know what I'm talking about. Some people listening, may even think that this is a good thing, although I hope not.
I don't think so, no.
No, right. I'm not sure what kind of shows you've had in the past, but
I don't want to be a Luddite, but I don't trust what's down the pipe.
Yeah. Of course, we can't afford to be Luddites. I mean, we couldn't be doing this now,
exactly,
if we were. But certainly to be preparing for a Luddite future, I would say is not only sensible but sane. I mean, that it would insane and delusional not, unless we're very old, to not be preparing for that, because the trajectory is very much the Matrix. Unfortunately, that movie's been completely tainted in a number of different ways, but they did kind of get it right at the time as a metaphor. That's the future that we're headed for, as human beings being embedded into a machine intelligence structure and becoming like living batteries whose physical energy, kinetic energy is used as a power source, and whose consciousness is used to inform and enliven or animate artificial intelligence.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And yes, for the audience thinking, well, how could Kubrick do all these flops? That doesn't happen in Hollywood. You just talk about the Wachowskis tapped into something amazing, or they ripped off Grant Morrison or Philip K. Dick. That's for debate. But they have not had a hit since The Matrix or the Matrix trilogy, yet they keep getting work. So you wonder, what are they selling? Somebody's allowing them to sell something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of pain, not speaking of pain, I felt bad because you said you had to watch Eyes Wide Shut 4 times, and you call it Eyes Wide Shit.
Well, that was a typo. A Freudian typo, no doubt. But the I is right next to the U on the keyboard.
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah, and I would have to agree because I watched the movie when it came out, and those days I was pretty much a practicing ecumenical Roman Catholic, and I thought this movie was boring. It was soulless. It was mechanical. But even later on, as I got into conspiracy and synchromysticism, I was like, okay, I like the symbology and all that, but I want to be at least entertain me while I'm watching this stuff. And it was dreadful. Do you think this movie, do you think he really wanted to do AI, or what was the purpose of Eyes Wide Shut? Or it almost seems like a big misdirection.
Well, because he did do AI with Kubrick, with Spielberg, he produced Spielberg, so something got done there, although it's, doesn't seem to have really fit with the Kubrickon very much. That's why I don't write about it. Eyes Wide Shut, he wanted to do for decades. He kept trying to get it made, or at least going through the early steps, a number of times throughout his career. And then he finally did, and it was his final movie. And I think it is a fitting final movie for my thesis anyway. I mean, it's certainly the most demonstrably bad Kubrick movie, even if the Kubrick machinery, the Kubrickon, has managed to somehow, it's like the Mandela effect, it's somehow changed reality without changing the movie, but changed to create a different consensus, right? That whether this movie is now a masterpiece. I find that very alienating, I have to say, but I mean, I shouldn't, because I know that the world is a crazy place, and there's obviously much crazier things going on than people thinking that Eyes Wide Shut is a good movie. But it is useful to me in my thesis in a number of different ways, but the two obvious ones that I've just touched on being that Kubrick's spell was powerful enough for him to make a demonstrably poor movie, and still for it somehow to get hailed. Eventually, it took many years and many viewings, no doubt, for many of these critics and people to convince themselves and thereby the world that it was actually a swan song, one of his last great movies. And so what I play with in Kubrickon is that this principle or this methodology that I touched on already, that Kubrick wanted to make movies that were somehow soulless and empty, that it reached its apotheosis with Eyes Wide Shut, where he became even more audacious. And this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, I admit, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it's consistent with the thesis. And he thought, how bad can I make a movie and still have people hail it as a masterpiece? Because then I've really got them. There's a saying like that. If you can get people to believe something that they absolutely know is untrue, then you've got them. Right? There's nothing more. Right? They'll not question anything at that point. They've pretty much surrendered their, I won't say right, but their option to discernment. They've basically said, I don't need discernment. I don't want discernment. I want you to tell me what is a good movie, Mr. Kubrick. And I want you to tell me, Dr. Fauci, what's safe to put into my body. Right? That's the complete annihilation of discernment. And it's replaced by just blanket consent. I just consent to what the all-powerful, all-seeing eye dictates for me. It's a world of men made gods, or God made men, whatever. Right. So anyway, quite fanciful. But Eyes Wide Shut, yeah. So I think he did. I do think there's some truth in this, that he wanted to make each and every scene, particularly the early scenes, as tone deaf as he could. Now, the initial response was someone like Hale, was that he's just lost touch with human beings because he's lived in this mansion in England for so long. And I think that's definitely part of it. But I also think there's something else was going on, that he was curious about experimenting with this. Could he make scenes in which human beings didn't really act like human beings? I mean, people have said now, well, it's dreamlike. It's supposed to be like a dream, but it's not. I mean, who the hell has dreams like that? David Lynch can do dreamlike,
right?
When he's good, but that's not dreamlike. That's something else. It's just really artificial and really stilted and really repellent. So yeah, I would say he was attempting to do something else, which has to do with this overall principle of confounding the audience's, not just their expectations, but their actual experience while they're watching a movie. What's going on here? It's not working. This movie isn't working, but it's a Kubrick movie. Not only that, it's Kubrick's last movie. It has to be great. I have to make it great. How can I make this experience great? Otherwise, my life is completely compromised, because my whole life revolves around Kubrick being a great filmmaker. And so somehow the viewer will summon from within them the means by which to reforge Eyes Wide Shut as a subjective experience, as something that's meaningful, even though what's on the screen is deliberately intended to be not meaningless, but somehow hollow and inept and clunky and just wrong. Right? There's just something deeply wrong here. So, as I said in the book, for a movie that I absolutely have hated every time I've seen it, I've never before gone back to it so many times.
For the audience, this is simply a small part of the Kubrickon. I love, of course, a topic. I love the simulation. Jason goes into that, into the psychology, the hive mind, and again, so much more from this excellent book. As he writes, this is not Deus ex machina, but this is God into the machine. We are being harvested and drained to create this new egregore for the coming century, this AI that's going to take the world, and it's a big club and we're not part of it. So definitely read the book. And Jason, they can get the book now at the usual suspects?
I strongly discourage anyone who takes any of this conversation seriously not to use Amazon ever again.
Exactly.
And the publishers are cooperating with this attempt to save people from Jeff Bezos by offering 20% off the book, which maybe makes it possibly competing with Amazon prices. I don't know. So there'll be a link. I don't know if you have a place where you can put.
Sure. Yeah, I can put it on the show notes. Send it to me.
Okay. So there's a link at my website, which will then take them to the publisher's site, and then there's a code which I'll put, which is also at my website. If they use that code, they'll get 20% off the list price. And as long as that's before the end of March, which is the official release date. So yeah, that's what I encourage people to do if they do want to read it.
Well, wonderful. Well, you heard it here. There'll be the link so you can get the book when it comes out. And I got a lot out of it to try to understand the machine. Welcome to the machine, my son. What did you dream? It's all right. We told you what to dream. Let's dream something better. Well, Jason, as always, really enjoyed talking to you, and as always, look forward to your next work.
Yeah, well, thanks, Miguel. We've been doing this for quite some time, haven't we? So,
we haven't gotten rid of us yet. Yet.
Until next time, then.
Thank you. And there you have it, you veterans of 1,000 psychic wars. Jason always provides so much stirring research and revelation. In our second part, Jason will share which of Kubrick's films he liked and disliked, and the reasons for this. We'll take a deep dive into A Clockwork Orange, you little droogs. We'll talk about Jung and how the Swiss magician influenced Stanley Kubrick. Jason will discuss the concepts of trauma and disassociation within Kubrick's Kubrickon and outside in each of our lives. And yes, we shall hit the topic of mind parasites and much more. So please become a member for the full psychic antibiotic. It's only $6.99 a month for AB Prime or $4.99 at Red Circle. or whatever you want to pledge on Patreon. You'll get access to my private Facebook group and Discord channel for AB Prime members and higher level patrons. If you find value in this content, please support this Red Pill Cafeteria. Your help can be in the form of some shekel donations on Stripe or the US mail. There is also a link on the show notes if you want to leave a tip, or you can tip on any YouTube show. If you want to help via Bitcoin or other crypto, reach out to me for an address. Consider joining the Finding Hermes program, where we have bi-monthly meetings on Gnostic practices and rituals, as well as some cool Q&As. The Virtual Alexandria, the premier and only Gnostic online course, is also open for thee. Recently added the in-depth lesson, The Characteristics of Mary Magdalene. If you need help with all or any of these choices, just message my ass. I'm always here to help, and I truly appreciate your help. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself, your true self, here in the desert of the real. Hello and goodbye, as always.